The Conductor on Early Film, Coordinating Romantic Era Orchestral Expression. This presentation focuses on the role of conductors in orchestral performance practices, examining the conductor on early film and the observable approaches to coordinating Romantic Era orchestral expression. Considering that conductors prior to the 19th century generally led from their instrument, conductors who flourished in the 1800s were early pioneers in the technique of gesturing without an instrument. Through physical gestures that went beyond a mere keeping of a steady pulse, prominent conductors developed approaches to create, coordinate, and elicit an interpretation of orchestral composition. The large symphony orchestra that developed in 19th century Europe was conceived as a genre capable of highly flexible possibilities for expression. The chemistry of a conductor and an orchestra had the potential to form an individualized interpretation, comparable to the musical individuality expressed by the leading soloists of the time. While the large orchestra posed new challenges for coordinated playing, conductors developed new techniques for both keeping the ensemble together and preserving the interpretive freedom that prevailed in the 19th century. The conductors in the above list were active too early in history to have had their performances recorded or caught on video, so concert reviews, written accounts, marked scores, and treatises give us a sense of their musicianship. One can find many quotations from the 19th century that describe conductors such as Gustav Mahler, Hector Berlioz, Richard Wagner, and Fritz Steinbach, to name a few. These serve as informative descriptions about their abilities to elicit from orchestras various nuances, contrasts in color, flexibility of tempo, and more, through their musical leadership. The next list includes a selection of prominent conductors who all made recordings, and some of whom were included in video footage. While we can only read about the previous generation of conductors, such recordings and video footage provide direct access to the way that orchestras responded to these conductors. For every piece discussed in this presentation, one can find numerous recordings from the first half of the 20th century that offer an incredibly wide range of interpretations. Even the same orchestra, with recordings of the same piece not far apart in time, can sound significantly different under separate conductors. In other words, each conductor formed a special relationship, a chemistry, if you will, that led to a distinct interpretation. The available footage of conductors leading prominent orchestras give us a glimpse into the visual content that such ensembles of the early 20th century were responding to on the podium. This enables an understanding of how such gestures related to the orchestral performance practices of the time. We will begin with footage that still leaves a great deal to the imagination, as it is a silent film of Arthur Nikisch. We have numerous first-hand accounts of his conducting, such as Ippolitov Ivanov's recollection of Nikisch's Moscow performance in 1888 with the Russian Musical Society Orchestra. He writes, "With each phrase, with each period, I saw how there arose before my very eyes the edifice of a symphony which was completely new for me. The Fifth Symphony acquired under Nikisch by means of a specific tempo, resilience, and rhythmic energy. He endowed the music with a cheerful mood in spite of the minor key. His interpretation of the whole movement was truly one of genius." In the silent film, we can see a flowing, graceful, and nuanced technique illustrating such accounts that describe how Nikisch was able to effortlessly lead an ensemble from note to note and from phrase to phrase. The first sample is an original video clip. The second time through, I will snap along to the flexibility of pulse led by Nikisch. Another conductor on film who demonstrates an elasticity of pulse was Leo Blech, who held major posts at the Berlin State Opera, the Vienna Volksoper, and the Latvian National Opera and Ballet. There's an extant video of Blech conducting the Berlin State Opera Orchestra in Wagner's Prelude to Die Meistersinger. Offering context to this footage, Wagner writes about Die Meistersinger in his conducting treatise, commenting that the main tempo of this piece was inscribed by me as sehr mäßig bewegt, meaning something the same as allegro maestoso in the older style of signature. No tempo stands more in need of modification than this, when maintained for any length, and especially when the thematic subjects are treated strongly episodically. One sees the markings tempo and crescendo following a rallentando. Then, at the entrance of the trumpets, Wagner writes sehr gehalten. Gehalten translates to held in a literal sense. In current common practice, orchestras treat the tempo marking as an absolute return to a tempo, and the crescendo as a purely dynamic indication. As well, in recent and current common practice, gehalten is either taken as an instruction for sustained sound or generally disregarded. In the following video clip, Blech actually begins a tempo change at tempo, accelerating the pulse forward. This also supports the sense of crescendo as a growth in energy and excitement. In a similar way, Blech holds the tempo back from the accelerando at gehalten, perhaps indicative of the earlier understanding of the term. This treatment presents the new theme, which is the motive for the Meistersinger's march with a majestic and dignified entrance. In the footage, we can see how Blech generates the accelerando with an upward thrust, initiated by a click of the wrist. This occurs the beat before the orchestra's accelerando, acting almost as a preparatory breath for the new musical gesture. The conductor then manages the accelerando with increasingly small and marked gestures that guide the quickening tempo. We will now move to the English conductor, Sir Henry Wood, who demonstrates a notable gestural approach to articulation. In the following excerpt of Sir Henry Wood with the Queen's Hall Orchestra, he leads Percy Grainger's Shepherd's Hay. Here, the conductor's baton technique aligns with the articulation pattern of the melody, short, short, long. His manner of conducting also encourages the musicians to place a slight accent on the second beat, characteristic of the borrowed folk tune, which is from an English Morris dance. As a technical point, Henry Wood demonstrates the accent of beat 2 in part through his conducting in beat 1. we will frequently see a slight pause or slowing of the baton. This cues to the orchestra that an accent is coming. Then on beat 2, wood uses an upward motion that is generated from the wrist, popping up rapidly to express a vigorous sense of lift characteristic of the folk dance. While it is certainly imaginable that the orchestra could achieve these articulations without a consistent visual cue, Wood's relevant gestural approach enables the articulation patterns to be varied and nuanced, while still unified across the wind and string instruments of the orchestra. The next featured excerpt is footage of the Czech conductor František Stupka. He led the Czech Philharmonic from 1919 to 1946, and the Moravian Philharmonic from 1946 to 1956. I will present an excerpt of him conducting Dvořák's Eighth Symphony with the Czech Philharmonic in one of his returning performances from the 1950s. On the surface, Stupka's gestures appear simple. However, they reveal a great deal about how many conductors who emerged out of 19th century traditions chose and actualized their gestures in relation to the orchestra. In the following footage, we can see Stupka leading the finale of Dvořák's Eighth Symphony. Preceding the finale, the conductor leads a lyrical passage in the violins. At the transition to a faster tempo, the conductor's arms move in towards the middle of his body. This offers a visual cue to the orchestra that the tempo and musical character are about to change. After Stupka declaims the tempo with 4 accented downstrokes, he creates an overall sense of shape by conducting in the equivalent of a subdivided 1, gesturing down, up, for 1, 2, 1, 2, rather than articulating each beat individually. The orchestra plays with a sense of excitement, almost pushing forward the inner beats of the pulse to heighten the effect of the finale. Through a streamlined gestural approach, Stupka avoids weighing down this tempo generated by the ensemble, while still guiding the orchestra to cohere and build in energy for the culmination of this symphony.
Předvedla Česká filharmonie pod jeho vedením Dvořákovu symfonii G-dur. Tohle nebyl jen obvyklý pokles. Bylo to i...
The next featured conductor is Dean Dixon, who in his career was principal conductor of the Gothenburg Symphony, Sydney Symphony Orchestra, and toward the end of his career, the Frankfurt Radio Symphony from 1961 to 1974. Dixon, who studied at the Juilliard School, was of an early generation of American conductors who found success in Europe and abroad. This rehearsal clip is from the beginning of his work in Frankfurt from 1961, with Dixon conducting the first movement from Mahler's Seventh Symphony. Dixon begins the excerpt conducting in 2 beats per bar, but shifts to 4 beats per bar to guide the transition back to a tempo. In the opening phrases of the a tempo, he varies the speed of his gesture to communicate the ebb and flow of the phrasing, especially as it pertains to the fermatas in the first and second violins. Often, as the melody approaches the downbeats in the passage, there is a slight slowing down in the ensemble, reflecting not explicit notation in the score, but implications of tempo from Mahler's dynamic instructions. Later on, when the score indicates drängend, or urging, Dixon shifts his gesture to the center of his body, where he uses vertical movement to clearly indicate the acceleration of tempo. This rehearsal footage appears to be one of the only surviving films of Dixon conducting. Willem Mengelberg, longtime conductor of the Amsterdam Concertgebouw Orchestra from 1895 to 1945, can also be observed in footage from the year 1931. In an excerpt from Weber's Overture to Oberon, we can notice Mengelberg shifting between conducting in 2 and 4, alternating between giving the quarter notes and the half notes as the tactus, as a means of guiding tempo fluctuation. In the following excerpt, he uses this pulse alternation to guide the clarinet's melody and the violin section's response. While there is no accelerando and ritardando marked in the score, Mengelberg complements the ascending contour of the second phrase with a slight accelerando. The climax of the melody is then treated with a slight hold, followed by a poco ritardando to end the phrase. As well, when the violins play the melody, we can hear portamento. Simultaneously, Mengelberg's gesture offers an extra lift and bend so as to incorporate the timing of the portamento in the collective phrasing. It is also well to note that Mengelberg specifies the tempo shifts so that the accompanying strings, which have held notes underneath the clarinet and first violin's melody, know exactly where to place their note changes. In coordination with Mengelberg's shifts from 2 to 4 that show deviations from a tempo, the ensemble actualizes a distinctly coordinated sense of orchestral phrasing. Composer Heitor Villa-Lobos extensively recorded his own works as a conductor, yet hardly any footage of him on the podium survives. There is one newsreel from Brazil that exists, with small excerpts of Villa-Lobos conducting shown throughout the film. Despite the minimal footage, I think it is possible to begin to get an impression of Villa-Lobos' conducting style as an interpreter of his compositions. First, we will listen to a recording of him conducting that is particularly fluid in its treatment of tempo. This is his Bachianas Brasileiras No. 5, which fused Brazilian folk styles with the compositional techniques of J.S. Bach. Perhaps the performative qualities of Brazilian folk music also informed Villa-Lobos' conception of tempo in this work, as one can hear a distinctive quality of ebb and flow in the performance by the ensemble and soloist. We will now watch the newsreel footage of Villa-Lobos. The music is asynchronous to the film, but it is possible that the audio is from the event that is shown.
Sob a regência do maestro Villa-Lobos, milhares de estudantes entoam diversos hinos patrióticos. A grande massa popular, que se concentra no local, acompanha com interesse o desenrolar da cerimônia. Acompanhando o coral, a orquestra do Teatro Municipal e várias bandas de música formam um conjunto soberbo de 300 figurantes. Do jardim suspenso do Ministério da Educação, o presidente Vargas assiste às crianças levantarem as bolas de gás, azuis, verdes, amarelas e brancas.
And finally, we will watch the isolated excerpts of Villa-Lobos conducting. After they are played at normal speed, they will be played again in slow motion to more clearly see the quality and nuances of his gesture. One can notice the variety of size in Villa-Lobos' conducting gestures, the speed of his motion, and quality of emphasis in the articulation of the beats. This kind of visual information can be connected to the expressive qualities of his recordings, such as in the Bachianas Brasileiras No. 5, creating a better understanding of the technique behind such interpretations by Villa-Lobos. In the final clip of footage for this presentation, we will look at the Austrian conductor Erich Kleiber, who happened to be Leo Blech's successor at the Berlin State Opera Orchestra. In this circa 1932 film, Kleiber leads the orchestra in the famous On the Beautiful Blue Danube. The specific excerpt we will watch leads into the fourth waltz of the composition. We can observe Erich Kleiber showing nuanced articulations, lifts, and accentuation in his gesture, which are then reflected in the orchestra's playing. As well, the conductor alternates between pulsing in 1 and 3 to lead the flexibility and tempo. Kleiber pulses in 3 as the fourth waltz begins slightly slower, creating a vocal-like treatment of the new theme. Kleiber then eases his way into the conducting in 1 by the bar as the tempo gets faster and faster. This culminates in the quickened tempo of the waltz's second half, which evokes a more celebratory sentiment. In addition to Erich Kleiber's guiding of tempo, we can also observe the contrasting character of his gesture. For the first half of the waltz, he uses smoother gestures with his wrist to show nuanced points of emphasis. In the second half, his gestures are more arm-based, demonstrating marked accentuations and a march-like visual for the orchestra. Different conductors, even of the same era, delivered different interpretations. This rendering of the famous On the Beautiful Blue Danube, which was recorded countless times in the first half of the 20th century, reflects Erich Kleiber's specific chemistry with the orchestra. His physical gestures clearly demonstrate his intentions, and likely enabled the instrumentalists to play with the same nuance as if they were soloists, but in coordination with their sections and with the rest of the orchestra. While we know that conductors in the 19th and early 20th centuries were prominent and influential musical figures, it is challenging to understand their role in actualizing past performance practices. After all, a conductor's gesture is not an end in itself, but rather intended to elicit a certain way of playing from the orchestra. Early footage of conductors presents snapshots into the gestural technique that conductors demonstrated to orchestras in performance, a significant, if not indispensable, element to understanding how the orchestral music of this period was performed. This provides tremendous insight and numerous possibilities for today's ensembles and conductors, offering approaches and starting points for effectively recreating such orchestral performance practices today.